This one is the most contentious of all of the different logical connectives, and therefore the most interesting one. I actually have entire books written just about this connective, the conditional. In our textbook, Smith considers the following proposition. If that is smoke, then there is a fire. Now notice this proposition is actually made out of two smaller propositions. That is smoke and there is a fire. So again, this is a connective, right? It's putting together two different component propositions into a new compound proposition. And this connective is expressed by the words if and then kind of together. Now we've already seen two different connectives that put two different propositions together, and we said that they were both truth functional connectives, meaning that the truth value of the compound proposition is totally dependent upon the truth values of the component propositions that go into making it up. Is this a truth functional connective like the other two? That's a great question. Well, let's think about this. What would make this compound proposition false? Well, it would be if that was smoke, but then there was no fire, right? I'm not saying that's possible. I'm saying that's what would make this compound proposition false. What would make this compound proposition true? Well, unfortunately, that's part of that whole contentiousness I talked about before. I mean, it seems like what would make this true is the fact that fires cause smoke. And yet, that would take us out of the realm of truth functionalness, right? It wouldn't no longer be the case that this compound proposition is true solely because one or the other or something like one of the components are true, something like that, right? It would instead be true because of this causal connection. So here's what we're going to say. And that may be absolutely true. There may be a way for you to express that. There may be a connective that goes with that. But when we use this word conditional, we're going to talk about a specific kind of connective. A connective that results in a false compound proposition whenever the first one is true and the second one is false. And otherwise, we'll say it's a true compound proposition. That's what we'll mean by the word conditional. And we're not going to be saying that people are wrong if they're using it, this word if then in different ways. But that brings up a second interesting point. Notice I said it's false if the first one is true and the second one is false, right? Could you switch these two things around? Could I say if there is a fire, then that is smoke? Well, no. I mean, think about it. There could be a fire around and I'm looking at sand or something. I could be looking at a pterodactyl. Just because there is a fire doesn't mean that the thing that I'm looking at is smoke. And yet, it seems like the reverse is probably true, right? If I'm looking at smoke, there must be a fire somewhere. So this connective is unique in that it matters which component is which. We're going to call one of them the antecedent and one of them the consequent. That word antecedent, I always like to tell my students to think about in Spanish antes, right before, or you might think of antebellum, right? Ante up, right? Means like you put in the money before you actually start to gamble, or an antechamber, anteroom. I don't know. Ante typically means before. Consequent usually sounds like consequence, right? So that's the one that comes second. So here ultimately is what we're going to say. A conditional is the following kind of connective. It's a two-place connective, puts two different propositions together into a new proposition. And this conditional is false if and only if the antecedent is true and yet the consequent is false. Otherwise, we're going to say that this conditional is true. So when we say conditional, that's what we mean. We mean a compound proposition that's false if the antecedent is true and the consequence is false, and otherwise that it's true. In other words, if the antecedent is false, then it's always going to be true. And if the consequent is true, then once again, it will always be true because we'll never have that scenario where the antecedent is true and the consequent false. Is this a useful notion? I don't know. That's part of the debate of logic. As we go forward in this course, we'll be able to evaluate and see if we like this kind of definition. And we might even be able to manipulate it a little bit to get a better definition, but we'll have to see. Now, this all seems very confusing, right? I mean, why are we using this word conditional in this way? A lot of times we use this if then and we don't mean what we just said, where it's false if and only if the first one is true and the second one is false and otherwise it's true. A lot of times we don't use the word if then like that. So why are we learning it here? Well, actually conditionals end up being very useful in different ways. If you don't believe me, check out the first video of this playlist. And there I give you a scenario that can only be handled with a conditional the way that we're looking at it. And I make the point there that it could save you a lot of time. In fact, it could get you a job. your dream job even. Also, if you've ever worked in computer science, if you've even used an Excel spreadsheet and had to use the formulas, then you'll know that if-thens are very important. So conditionals are important. One last kind of confusing thing. I said it was true to say that if that is smoke, then there is a fire, but false to say if there is a fire, then that is smoke. What about if I said this? There is a fire if that is smoke. Would that be true? Well, yeah, it seems like when you look at it, it seems like you took the if that is smoke and you just, swapped it around and put it at the end there, right? There is a fire if that is smoke. That's really the same words, just in a different order. So you could actually see the antecedent end up following the consequent. But what about this? What if I said, there is a fire only if that is smoke? There is a fire only if that is smoke. Well, that's more like saying, if there is a fire, then that is smoke. So we do have one important thing to note here, right? When you say A if B, what you're really saying is if B, then A. When you say A only if B, what you're saying is actually the opposite, if A, then B. I know, super confusing, but I'll tell you what, go on and do section 1.6.4.1 exercise, and we'll see that if you can figure out which ones are the antecedent and which ones are the consequent. And I think after a little bit of practice, it'll all be a lot clearer.